Well now, Jim O'Neill, the chairman of Goldman Sachs Asset Management, the Conservative MP Sajid, Javid, who used to be an executive at Deutsche Bank, are with us here. But first from Chicago, we're joined by Austan Goolsbee, who until very recently was the chairman of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisers. You haven't, Austan Goolsbee, by any chance been briefed on what was agreed, have you?
No, I haven't. I was out for the IMF meetings last week and the BBC debate, but they didn't give me the details.
As far as you understand it, then, how big is this crisis by comparison with the banking crisis of 2008, which you were intimately involved in?
Well, I'd say it has the potential to easily be that big. It might even turn into something bigger than that. There are two fundamental problems. The first is, in the 2008 crisis, the U.S., as your opening package indicated, took steps to recapitalize the banks, forced them to open the books in the stress test, and it was only by doing that that we facilitated private sector money coming in to refund the banks. But it was deeply and terribly unpopular. And so even though the banks have paid back the money that the government gave them, the government, if we had been a parliamentary system, as I say, we would have fallen twice over this period, because no one is happy on any side with having to do that. You now look in Europe, they didn't open up the books. They never forced the banks to fess up to what problems they had in 2008. And now you're about to add on top of it a sovereign debt crisis. There's every reason to think the market is in a bit of a panic, thinking the banks are way undercapitalized, potentially insolvent, and they're going to need to own up to what the problems are and put a lot of money into them, and that is not going to be popular.
Do you get the feeling in this that the Europeans have been wishing on a star, have been actually hoping that things will turn out for the best and have been insufficiently rigorous?
Yes, absolutely. Look, we've had 2 years plus since the last crisis that they could have been raising private capital. That's what they were doing at great pains, I might add, in the United States, but they did it. Now, it's always tempting not to reveal how bad things are and hope that it goes away, but if things get worse, which they have here, then you're just in a deeper and deeper spot. So now when they open up the books, there's going to be a shock of horror when people first look at it and say, oh my goodness, it's even worse than we thought.
Jim O'Neill, assuming that what little we've learned, it's all unofficial, it's none of it's on paper, about what's being proposed, can it be adequate to retrieve the situation?
Well, I don't know on the
hang on a second.
It could be.
Hang on a second, Mr. Goolsbee. I just want to ask Jim O'Neill here. Go on.
One would hope so.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There's certainly, by creating this notion, something that you didn't touch on, the G20 themselves were looking for some big bang solution like this by the November G20 meeting in France. That's at least given a 6-week window for them to try and figure out what's real, what's not, and how committed everybody is. So, in some ways, that's, in my judgment, the slightly clever part of all of this, because to work all this stuff out is not easy.
Does it inspire confidence in someone like you?
It gives me a bit more hope that they're now recognising the size of the dilemma that they've got themselves into. For much of the past 12 months, what one repeatedly sees is denial of there being the kind of scale of challenge that the numbers you just talked about imply. But here we're talking big numbers, and one thing I'd slightly differ with a tone I heard from over the water there is it might well be that they can ring-fence Greece and don't need all of this money. But one of the attractions of such a policy, which works so well in the States, if you indicate you're prepared to put in X, you might need only a percentage of X.
Sure. So. Do you think it can work, Sajid, Javid?
Absolutely not. This is just a sticking plaster. It's a further attempt just to kick the can down the road, but it doesn't address the fundamental problem, which is the euro itself. It's a bankruptcy machine. It was that right from the start, and this kind of problem was always going to happen. And it's also another thing. It's also a fiddle. It's a fiddle because even people that have said that the euro requires a fiscal union, this is actually a backdoor way of trying to achieve that fiscal union. And it's being done because European leaders still don't accept that they need to go to their electorates and get permission to do something like this.
OK, this raises the absolutely critical question, Austan Goolsbee, I'd like to ask you about. You alluded to it earlier. The question of how you make this sort of thing happen in a democracy, and whether a democracy, particularly some country like Germany, is going to put up with this imposition.
Yeah, look, I think this crisis, while being a short-run banking financial crisis, is rooted, as we just said, in the origins of the euro. You've got Southern Europe strapped to Northern Europe. Germany's had high productivity growth and has been able to be a very successful exporter without any appreciation of their currency. And somebody's got to give an explanation of how Southern Europe is going to start growing again. Because if they can't devalue to export their way out of it, if they're not going to grow, then they either have to be subsidized on a permanent basis, or else we're in for a big mess. We're going to be, in some near term, back to this same kind of fiscal crisis that we're in right now.
And they can't grow again. Southern Europe cannot grow again unless those countries are allowed to have their own currencies again. What I would propose is that we change the treaty that created the euro in the first place, and we allow these countries to adopt a second legal tender in their current countries. It will still be painful, it will still lead to losses, but it will be a lot less pain than this muddling through at this moment.
Jim O'Neill, why were you smiling?
Well, you know, one has to be always careful with the euro as to what you would like as to what actually is reality and what may happen. You know, we have to remember a lot of these countries went into this thing for deep, complex reasons which involve a lot of European history and politics. So it's not just straight, simple economics. There's a lot of...
There was always as much a political project as an economic project.
I think it's worth starting from assuming it was a political project.
Well, maybe the price of survival of the euro and everything that it represents is the demise of some democratically elected governments.
Well, I also want to raise another thing. It's currently very fashionable to say that Germany's always so competitive. People are conveniently forgetting for the first 2 or 3 years of the euro's life, it was just as fashionable to argue that Germany would be very uncompetitive and could never regain it. And over the first decade, Spain created most of the employment in the euro area. So, of course, we're going through a dreadful crisis here, which certainly raises many doubts right at the core of how it was constructed. But as with any crisis, ones we've had in the US and in Asia, one of the keys is if policymakers learn from a crisis and you can build something better. We'll have to see how committed
Jeremy,
they are.
Well, good evening, Dr. Pangloss, eh?
Jeremy, I've spent 20 years advising countries that got themselves into sovereign debt problems, and this is unlike any other that I've seen in terms of scale.
What it does raise is, I mean, you mentioned the United States as well, it does raise entire questions about the systems of governance that apply to global capitalism now, doesn't it?
I think it's of that dimension, yeah. I mean, what the other really interesting aspect to me about all of this in the past week is that every major G20 member is sticking the nose in as well and saying this is of a potentially global dimension, so we're interested in it being a solution, or finding a solution, which is why I say the November G20 has now been put forth as the major point of delivery. So this is of major global importance.
Austan Goolsbee, there are really profound questions raised by all of this. What would you do?
Well, you know, once you get to this spot, it's always tougher. I think the first thing you definitely have to do is open up the books and do a real stress test where you reveal to the private market, here's the situation we're in and here's where the banks are. And then you'd have to commit to recapitalize if they are able to succeed in the plan they're describing, and would be committed to a significant recapitalization of the financial institutions. That'd be a good start. But I still think we've got to think about the broader Eurozone experiment. If we're going to get in very different growth environments. And so if you look pre-Euro, when Germany integrates and you combine East and West Germany, it is a massive expense on West Germany to lock those two together and essentially make a currency area where there wasn't a natural fit. It was done for political reasons, but everybody had to acknowledge it was going to take a long time and require a lot of transfer payments to get that to work.
Okay,
and I think when they formed the euro, they weren't thinking it would be that way, but I think now people are thinking maybe it is going to be that way.
Jim and Neil, briefly, I mean, can the Chinese get us out of this mess?
We want them to get us out of all messes all over the world, don't we? So why not add this one on the end? I think, again, with the G20 collective group name being brought to the fore, that the Chinese will have a role to play, or not necessarily just by buying a lot of European debt. In terms of broader monetary policy and China reducing interest rates, rather like what happened in the spring of '09, it is conceivable that a number of players can do their little bit for making the world a stronger place.
Thank you all very much.